Today we're going to talk about teams and team dynamics. And I should probably start with saying that even though teams have been found very effective in many cases, especially in those where common goal and some sort of interdependencies were present, uh, in many other cases where those two are not present, perhaps individual approach is a better one. In fact, we know from empirical research that those organizations that attempted to implement teams, if many of them failed to do so because they tried to implement teams where teams were simply not called for. That's why the practical advice for a manager would be instead of looking at the team to get the work done, try to look at the work itself and see if that leads to the concept of teamwork. That's why uh, the overarching advice uh, is that it should be the nature of the work, the interdependence and the presence of a common goal that should dictate whether individual or group approach should be applied to boost productivity. Because we have to remember that team design, team implementation, and running teams is very expensive. We have to imagine that employees uh, suddenly have to take all the functions, learn all the functions that traditionally belonged to a manager. Things like running meetings, things like running budgets, things like conflict resolution. All those things uh, have to be learned. Now, there is, of course, place for individually made decisions, and there are a number of circumstances that would warrant that, such as efficiency needed, time is short, expert knowledge is needed, for example, statistician, clear accountability required, and nature of the information requires confidentiality. And of course, team approach, team decisions, collective decisions are better when common goal is present, interdependence, uh, complex creative tasks, uh, a need for ownership in decision would also require collective decision making, and large workloads would also be part of those requirements. There are four major theories that attempt to explain why people join groups. The first one is referred to as propinquity theory. The theory presumes that people gather because of spatial and geographical proximity. It's easy to imagine situation in a classroom where people meet for discussion purposes. Obviously, and almost every student will join somebody nearby. They almost never travel across the classroom to join somebody at some distance. Second theory is referred to as interaction theory. That theory presumes that people join groups because of shared activities. And here again, we can imagine the group of athletes that meet together because of shared activities of, let's say, playing basketball. Third theory is referred to as a balance theory. The theory presumes that people gather together because of some sort of similarities. They could be age, it could be gender, it could be attitudes, it could be beliefs, uh, and any other demographics. And finally, the exchange theory presumes that People gather together because they've made some sort of a profit cost analysis, and they found out that joining a group actually uh, outweighs the profits of joining the group outweigh the costs. Another important dynamics of teamwork is that of social conformity, otherwise known as groupthink, and it is often defined as that uh, irrational thinking on the part of team members uh, who prematurely try to conform to the consensus and discourage any sort of dissent. Uh, there's a good example of that in a book of Hidden Brain by Shakam Vendatam, and who looked at two companies during 9/11 event. Two companies located in one of the towers, one on a 20th floor, another on 89th floor, with the latter one located on the higher floor surviving, and that on the 20th floor, which theoretically could escape much easier, did not make it at all. Simply perished, and he um, further research indicated that it had to do with groupthink, with social conformity, because people on the 20th floor felt compelled to discuss the options with each other. They probably didn't want to offend other members of the organization, and by the time any decision was made, the tower went down and they all perished. Now, on the other hand, the organization located on the 89th floor, uh, some leadership, some leader must have made a decision. Let's get the hell out of here, and consequently, they escaped on time. Finally, I would like to bring to your attention the concept of conflict management, and I would probably want to contrast that with conflict avoidance. That was a very popular concept in the 20th century, where organizations were very much, for the most part, structured as a bureaucracy hierarchy where everybody sat in the cubicles, separated by departments, and work being done by bureaus, so to speak. Therefore, the name bureaucracy. Uh, Bureau, the department. So we had the HR people together, accountants together, marketing people separately, and that was also separated by top management, middle management, and lower management. So that allowed us all to control conflict to a certain extent, primarily because one of the primary reason for conflict occurrence is individual differences, and there's really not much we can do about it from the management standpoint, other than making people aware that those differences occur and they are reasons for our clashes. And those clashes are unavoidable, especially if people differ, like for example in context of teams. We have teams, we have team members from different departments, and of course the way of thinking, well, maybe the way of looking is also different, and that has some contribution to conflict in organizations. The second reason, apart from differences, why conflict occurs has to do with unsatisfied human needs. That's the fundamental concept in motivation. And of course, here management has a little bit more control, especially within the domain of the reward structure, which is really the primary function of a manager from the management standpoint and motivation. Now, of course, even these days, when we move to that modern type of organizations, team-based organizations, learning organizations, we are finding that conflict can be useful. And in fact, that's the reason why we get people together. So some clashes occur, and people leave the boxes, so to speak, and some creativity, some innovation may be generated as a result of that. And we know it does happen. It does happen. That's why we moved from conflict avoidance to conflict management, because we know we can benefit from it. Now, the research shows that managers still tend to eliminate conflict at all costs for the most part, perhaps because they're uncomfortable with it, perhaps because there's no training, not enough training have been exposed to. And perhaps it has something to do with the reward structure. Managers are still rewarded for keeping things quiet. Um, but of course, it may also have something to do with the culture we live in, and we've been exposed to during throughout our lifetime. Let's, for example, home. Let's start home. We'll remember our mothers saying, "Don't fight with your brother. Don't beat your sister." Okay, here you go. No conflict. Another one would have to do with the school situation. Now, let's think about it. There's really instructor is expected to be always right. There is not that much argumentation going on in the classroom, right? Um, and also religions. When we look at the religions, most of them, they preach peace. So let me give you, whatever the reasons for that, let me give you a few winning strategies on conflict management. The first one say, be hard on a problem, soft on a person. They always separate those two. In every conflict situation, there are always those two issues we're going to deal with. Is the issue at stake, and the person, and the relationship we try to keep with that person. So separating those two is important, and always try to be soft on the person. One of the problems with conflict is that we tend to personalize it. Well, that's not the way to go about it. It's basically what that winning strategy is pointing to. Now, you might ask, what if the problem is the person, right? It may happen. Well, here's an answer to that. The answer is focus, instead of focusing on a person, focus on behavior of that person. Okay, so instead of saying you irritate me, the person, you may say the way you speak to me irritates me. Okay, so that would be an example. Um, the other two strategies I'd like to mention to you have to do with the language, the linguistics. And the first one advises you on using uh, I language instead of instead of you. Um, so, for instance, not to sound so confrontative and combative, you might say, you, instead of saying you did not respond to my memo, you might want to say, I did not receive your response to to my memo. Okay, so instead of you, use I. It's much softer. Okay, and finally, also the linguistic concept. Instead of using but, use tend to use and, because so. For example, instead of saying uh, it's interesting what you said, but let's listen to what I have to say, which sounds very well. You basically dismissed what that person said. So instead, we might say, well, it's interesting what you say, and let's listen to what I have to say. Okay, so you basically used your contribution, your thought, as a contribution, as a addition to the conversation, rather than contradiction or dismissal of what the other person said. Thank you, and till the next time.